You win every argument, but somehow lose every relationship, watching colleagues distance themselves while you stand firm in your correctness. Every time you prove your point, you wonder why victory feels so empty and why people seem less eager to work with you, even though you know you're right. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying human nature, discovering that the need to be right is often the very thing that makes us wrong about what truly matters. What I learned about influence and relationships will transform how you handle disagreements, showing you how to be effective instead of just correct. The same principles that helped millions build better relationships can turn your expertise into genuine influence rather than isolated righteousness. But first, like this video, subscribe for more relationship wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to choose influence over being right. When I was a young man growing up in Missouri, I thought intelligence was about knowing more than everyone else. I carried facts like weapons, ready to draw them at a moment's notice to prove my superiority. I remember sitting in church, silently, correcting the preacher's biblical interpretations, or standing in my father's general store, smugly noting customers' grammatical errors. I believed that being right was the highest virtue, and I wore my correctness like a badge of honor. But something strange happened as I entered my 20s. Despite being one of the most knowledgeable people in my small town, I found myself increasingly lonely. People seemed to avoid deep conversations with me. They'd nod politely when I shared my insights, but their eyes would glaze over, and they'd find excuses to end our interactions. I couldn't understand it. Here I was, offering them the gift of accurate information, correct perspectives, and enlightened thinking. Yet they seemed ungrateful, almost resentful. My first real awakening came when I began teaching public speaking classes at the YMCA in New York City. I had prepared meticulously, armed with all the proper techniques, grammatical rules, and rhetorical principles. I knew I could teach these struggling speakers the right way to communicate. But week after week, I watched as my technically perfect instruction fell flat. Students would leave my classes more discouraged than when they arrived. One evening, a middle-aged salesman named Frank approached me after class. He'd been struggling with his presentations, making what I considered elementary mistakes in structure and delivery. I had spent considerable time correcting his errors, showing him the proper methods, explaining why his approach was wrong. "Mr. Carnegie," he said quietly, "I know you're trying to help, but every time you tell me what I'm doing wrong, I feel smaller. I came here hoping to gain confidence, but I'm leaving with less than when I started." That moment hit me like a physical blow. Here was a man who desperately wanted to improve, yet my insistence on being right about speaking techniques was actually making him worse. I realized I had been so focused on the correctness of my methods that I had completely ignored the human being standing before me. I was technically right about speech techniques, but I was utterly wrong about what Frank needed that night. I went home and looked in the mirror, not just at my reflection, but at my approach to teaching and relating to others. I saw a man who had confused knowledge with wisdom, correctness with effectiveness. I had been so busy being right that I had forgotten the fundamental purpose of communication: to connect with and help other human beings. From that moment forward, I began a different kind of education. Instead of focusing solely on what I could teach people, I started studying what they needed to learn. Instead of correcting their mistakes, I began looking for what they were doing right and building on those strengths. Instead of proving my expertise, I started proving my genuine care for their success. The transformation in my classes was immediate and dramatic. Students began to flourish, not because I had lowered my standards or abandoned correct principles, but because I had learned to deliver those principles in ways that built people up rather than tore them down. I discovered that the same information, delivered with encouragement rather than correction, with support rather than criticism, could transform lives instead of deflating spirits. This became the foundation of everything I would later teach and write. The realization that being right means nothing if you're wrong about what matters most to human beings: their dignity, their potential, and their fundamental need to feel valued and understood. Through years of observing human behavior, I came to understand what I call the correctness trap, a psychological snare that catches some of our brightest minds and turns their greatest strength into their greatest weakness. I've watched brilliant people destroy relationships, sabotage careers, and isolate themselves, all while being absolutely, technically, indisputably correct. The trap works like this: when we possess knowledge or expertise in a particular area, we naturally want to share it. This impulse itself isn't wrong, it's actually quite noble. The problem arises when sharing knowledge becomes about proving our superiority rather than genuinely helping others. What starts as a desire to educate slowly transforms into a need to demonstrate intellectual dominance. I remember a gifted engineer I once knew named Robert. He was exceptionally talented, with an almost photographic memory for technical specifications and industry standards. In every meeting, Robert would catch errors that others missed, point out flaws in reasoning, and provide more accurate data. He was right about everything, and I mean everything. His technical knowledge was impeccable, yet Robert was passed over for promotion after promotion. Colleagues stopped inviting him to planning sessions. When his input was absolutely necessary, they'd seek it through intermediaries rather than approach him directly. Robert became increasingly bitter, convinced that he was surrounded by inferior minds who couldn't appreciate his contributions. He was right about his technical superiority, but he was wrong about what was happening to his career and relationships. The correctness trap had claimed another victim. You see, when we consistently position ourselves as the person who knows better, who catches mistakes, who has the right answer, we unconsciously create a dynamic where others feel diminished in our presence. We become the teacher, and everyone else becomes the perpetual student. We become the judge, and everyone else becomes the defendant. This dynamic, no matter how unintentional, breeds resentment. I discovered that the need to be right often stems from deeper insecurities. When we correct others, we're not just sharing information, we're unconsciously trying to establish our worth, prove our intelligence, and secure our position in the social hierarchy. It's a defensive mechanism disguised as helpfulness. The most insidious aspect of this trap is that it's self-reinforcing. The more we correct others, the more they withdraw from us. The more they withdraw, the more isolated we become. The more isolated we become, the more we rely on our intellectual superiority as our primary source of it becomes a vicious cycle where being right becomes our identity rather than simply something we happen to be in a particular moment. I learned to recognize the warning signs in myself and others, the slight smile of satisfaction when catching someone's error, the eagerness to jump into conversations with corrections, the frustration when others don't immediately acknowledge our superior insight, the tendency to begin sentences with actually ... or, well, technically ... These are all symptoms of the correctness trap. Breaking free from this trap requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "How can I show them I'm right?" we must learn to ask, "How can I help them succeed?" Instead of focusing on the accuracy of information, we must focus on the impact of our communication. Instead of proving our intelligence, we must prove our care for others' well-being and growth. The paradox I discovered is this: the moment we stop needing to be right, we become infinitely more influential. When people sense that our primary motivation is their benefit rather than our validation, they become remarkably open to our insights and expertise. They stop seeing us as a threat to their ego and start seeing us as an ally in their success. This doesn't mean abandoning accuracy or accepting falsehoods. It means choosing our battles wisely and delivering truth in ways that strengthen rather than diminish the people we're trying to help. There's a profound difference between being factually correct and being relationally effective. And I learned this lesson through some of the most painful experiences of my early career. I've come to understand that you can win every argument and still lose everything that matters: relationships, influence, respect, and genuine connection with others. Let me share with you the story of my friendship with Charles, a fellow instructor I met during my early days in New York. Charles was exceptionally well-read, with opinions on everything from politics to philosophy to the proper way to tie a necktie. More importantly, his opinions were usually correct. He had facts, statistics, and expert sources to back up nearly every position he took. I watched Charles in social gatherings, and it was both fascinating and heartbreaking. Someone would mention a current event, and Charles would immediately provide additional context, often correcting misconceptions in the process. A person would share an experience from their travels, and Charles would offer historical background that sometimes contradicted their story. When people discussed their challenges at work, Charles would analyze their situations and point out the strategic errors they were making. Charles was right about almost everything. His knowledge was vast, his reasoning was sound, and his facts were accurate. Yet I noticed something troubling. Conversations would gradually die when Charles joined them. People would make polite excuses and drift away. Invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. Despite being one of the most knowledgeable people I knew, Charles was becoming increasingly isolated. The breakthrough moment came during a dinner party where the host mentioned struggling with his teenage son's rebellious behavior. Instead of offering sympathy or asking questions, Charles immediately launched into a detailed explanation of adolescent psychology, pointing out where the father's approach was scientifically flawed. He cited studies, referenced expert opinions, and provided a comprehensive analysis of the situation. Everything Charles said was accurate. His advice was sound. His knowledge was impressive. But I watched the father's face during this monologue, and what I saw broke my heart. The man wasn't feeling helped. He was feeling judged. He wasn't feeling supported. He was feeling inadequate. Charles's need to be right about parenting techniques had completely missed what the father actually needed: understanding, empathy, and reassurance that he wasn't alone in his struggles. That evening taught me that being right can make you wrong about what people truly need from you. When someone shares a problem, they're not always looking for a solution. When someone tells a story, they're not always seeking additional information. When someone expresses an opinion, they're not always asking for correction. Often, they're simply seeking connection, understanding, and the basic human need to be heard and valued. I began to notice this pattern everywhere. The manager who was right about company policy but wrong about employee morale. The spouse who was right about household finances but wrong about their partner's need for appreciation. The parent who was right about their child's academic potential but wrong about their child's emotional needs. Being right can make you wrong when it becomes more important than being kind. It can make you wrong when it prioritizes information over relationships. It can make you wrong when it focuses on proving your intelligence rather than proving your care for others. I learned to ask myself a crucial question before offering corrections or additional information. What does this person need from me right now? Sometimes they need accurate information. Sometimes they need to be heard. Sometimes they need encouragement. Sometimes they need someone to simply sit with them in their struggle without trying to fix it. The most influential people I've studied throughout my career have mastered this distinction. They possess tremendous knowledge and expertise, but they understand that influence comes not from being right, but from being right for the person and situation in front of them. They know when to share their knowledge and when to share their presence. They understand that being correct about facts means nothing if you're incorrect about human needs. This doesn't mean we should never share our knowledge or offer corrections when they're genuinely needed. It means we must develop the wisdom to know when being right serves others and when it serves only our own ego. It means learning to be right about what matters most, the fundamental human need for dignity, respect, and genuine connection. After decades of studying human behavior, I've come to understand that our compulsive need to be right isn't really about accuracy or helpfulness. It's about something much deeper and more primitive. It's about survival, status, and the fundamental human need to feel significant in an uncertain world. When I first began analyzing why intelligent people so often sabotage their relationships through constant correction, I assumed it was simply a matter of poor social skills or lack of awareness. But as I dug deeper, interviewing hundreds of individuals and observing patterns across different cultures and backgrounds, I discovered that the need to be right taps into some of our most basic psychological drives. Consider what happens in your mind the moment you hear someone state something incorrectly. There's an almost physical sensation, isn't there? A kind of mental itch that demands to be scratched. Your pulse quickens slightly. Your attention narrows. You feel an urgent need to speak up, to set the record straight. This isn't just intellectual preference, it's an emotional compulsion. I've traced this compulsion to what I call the significance drive. Every human being has a deep, often unconscious need to matter, to be important, to have value in the eyes of others. When we possess knowledge that others lack, correcting them becomes a way of demonstrating our worth. It's our mind's attempt to say, I matter because I know things you don't know. This drive becomes particularly powerful in people who have built their identity around their intelligence or expertise. I've worked with professors, doctors, engineers, and lawyers who literally cannot stop themselves from correcting others, even in casual social situations. Their professional success has been built on being right, and they've learned to derive their sense of self-worth from their superior knowledge. But there's another psychological factor at play, what I call defensive intelligence. Many people who compulsively correct others are actually operating from a place of insecurity rather than confidence. They've learned that being smart is their shield against feeling inadequate. They correct others not because they feel superior, but because they're terrified of being seen as inferior. I remember working with a brilliant woman named Margaret, who held multiple advanced degrees and worked as a research scientist. In professional settings, her expertise was invaluable and appropriately respected. But in social situations, Margaret would correct pronunciation, dispute historical facts, and offer unsolicited explanations on every topic imaginable. Through our conversations, I discovered that Margaret had grown up feeling overlooked and undervalued in a family that prioritized athletic achievement over academic success. Her intelligence became her lifeline, the one thing that made her feel special and worthy of attention. Correcting others wasn't about helping them, it was about constantly proving to herself and the world that she had value. This defensive mechanism creates what I call the expertise trap. The more we rely on our knowledge for our sense of worth, the more we need to demonstrate that knowledge to feel secure. It becomes an addiction of sorts, where each correction provides a temporary boost to our self-esteem, but the underlying insecurity remains unaddressed. I've also observed what happens to people when their corrections are challenged or dismissed. The emotional reaction is often completely disproportionate to the situation. They don't just feel intellectually disagreed with, they feel personally attacked, diminished, even humiliated. This is because their identity has become so intertwined with being right that any challenge to their accuracy feels like a challenge to their fundamental worth as a person. The irony is that this psychological pattern actually undermines the very thing it's trying to achieve. Instead of gaining respect and significance through constant correction, These individuals often find themselves increasingly isolated and dismissed. People begin to see them not as knowledgeable experts, but as insufferable know-it-all personalities. Understanding this, psychology was crucial in my own development and in helping others. I learned that breaking the need to be right pattern requires addressing the underlying emotional needs it's trying to meet. We must find healthier ways to feel significant, valuable, and secure in our relationships. The most successful transformation I've witnessed happens when people learn to derive their sense of worth not from what they know, but from how they impact others' lives. When we shift from trying to prove our intelligence to trying to prove our care for others, everything changes. We become less concerned with being right and more concerned with being helpful, supportive, and genuinely connecting with the people around us. This psychological shift doesn't happen overnight, but it's absolutely essential for anyone who wants to move from isolated correctness to genuine influence and meaningful relationships. In all my years of studying human nature, I've discovered that perfectionism is one of the most seductive yet destructive forces in relationships. It masquerades as a virtue who could argue against wanting to do things correctly, but I've watched it destroy more marriages, friendships, and professional partnerships than almost any other single trait. The perfectionist's dilemma became crystal clear to me through my relationship with my own wife, Lolita. In the early years of our marriage, I carried my professional standards into our personal life with devastating results. I would correct her grammar during casual conversations. I'd reorganize items she had arranged in our home. I'd offer helpful suggestions about more efficient ways she could handle household tasks. I genuinely believed I was being helpful. After all, wasn't it better for things to be done correctly? Wasn't I showing love by wanting our life together to be as perfect as possible? But I watched my wife's natural enthusiasm and spontaneity gradually diminish. She became hesitant to share ideas with me, anticipating correction. She started second-guessing herself in areas where she had previously felt confident. One evening, after I had helpfully pointed out a more logical way to organize her recipe collection, Lolita turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Dale," she said quietly, "I feel like I can never do anything right in your presence. I'm starting to feel like a failure in my own home." That moment shattered something inside me. Here was the woman I loved more than life itself, feeling diminished by my pursuit of correctness. I realized that my perfectionism wasn't creating a better life for us. Was creating a lonely life for both of us. I was so focused on doing things right that I was doing our relationship completely wrong. Began to study other perfectionists and found the same destructive pattern repeated over and over. There was the father who corrected his children's bedtime stories, prioritizing accurate plot details over magical shared moments. The friend who couldn't enjoy social gatherings because she was constantly noticing and mentioning organizational inefficiencies. The manager who killed team creativity by immediately pointing out the flaws in every new idea. What I discovered is that perfectionism in relationships creates what I call performance anxiety. When people know they'll be evaluated, corrected, or improved upon, they stop being authentic. They become performers trying to meet your standards, rather than partners sharing life with you. The relationship transforms from a sanctuary where people can be themselves into a stage where they must constantly audition for approval. The perfectionist's tragedy is that they drive away the very intimacy they're trying to perfect. People don't feel safe being vulnerable around someone who might correct their feelings, improve their stories, or optimize their experiences. They retreat into surface-level interactions, keeping their true selves hidden from the perfectionist's improving gaze. I learned that relationships aren't engineering projects to be optimized, they're gardens to be nurtured. Gardens are messy, unpredictable, and beautifully imperfect. When we try to engineer relationships with perfectionist precision, we kill the organic growth that makes them thrive. The courage to embrace imperfection became one of the most liberating discoveries of my life. I learned to celebrate my wife's unique ways of doing things, even when they differed from my preferences. I began to see her inefficiencies as expressions of her personality rather than problems to be solved. I discovered that her way of organizing recipes actually reflected her creative approach to cooking, and that my logical system would have stripped away the joy she found in the process. Breaking free from perfectionism required me to shift my focus from performance to presence. Instead of evaluating how well things were being done, I started appreciating that they were being done together. Instead of improving our experiences, I started simply enjoying them. Instead of perfecting our relationship, I started treasuring it exactly as it was, imperfections and all. The transformation was remarkable. As I stopped correcting and started connecting, Lolita's natural confidence returned. Our conversations became deeper and more authentic. Our home became a place of rest rather than evaluation. We found that our relationship was far more beautiful when we stopped trying to perfect it and started allowing it to unfold naturally. This doesn't mean abandoning all standards or accepting harmful behaviors. It means learning to distinguish between what truly matters and what simply satisfies our need for control and correctness. The most profound shift in my understanding of human relationships came when I discovered the difference between listening to understand and listening to correct. For most of my early life, I approached conversations like a fact-checker, constantly evaluating the accuracy of what others said and preparing my responses to set the record straight. This approach made me knowledgeable but not wise, informed but not influential. That I remember the exact moment this changed for me. I was having lunch with a businessman named Arthur who was telling me about his struggles with his teenage son. Arthur described how his boy had become distant and rebellious, no longer sharing his thoughts or seeking his father's advice. As Arthur spoke, I found myself mentally cataloging all the parenting mistakes he was making, preparing to offer him the correct approaches based on child psychology principles I had studied. But something in Arthur's voice made me pause. There was a pain there, a deep sadness that had nothing to do with parenting techniques. Instead of jumping in with my corrections and advice, I simply said, "That must be incredibly difficult for you." Arthur's eyes filled with tears. "It is," he said. "I feel like I'm losing my son, and I don't know how to get him back." For the next 30 minutes, I did something I had rarely done before. I simply listened. I didn't correct his approach or offer better strategies. I just listened as this man poured out his heart about his fear of failing as a father. What struck me was how much Arthur needed to be heard far more than he needed to be corrected. His parenting techniques might have been imperfect, but his love for his son was profound and genuine. By listening without judgment, I gave him the space to process his own feelings and even begin discovering his own solutions. This experience taught me that when we listen to correct, we're not really listening at all. We're waiting for our turn to speak, scanning for errors, preparing our responses. We miss the emotion behind the words, the real message being communicated, the human being standing before us who needs connection more than correction. I began practicing what I called pure listening, the art of giving someone your complete attention without any agenda to fix, improve, or correct them. This required tremendous discipline, because my natural instinct was still to jump in with helpful information or accurate clarifications. The results were transformative. When I stopped listening for mistakes, I started hearing what people really needed. When I stopped preparing corrections, I started understanding their actual concerns. When I stopped trying to prove my expertise, I started providing what they actually valued, the gift of being truly heard. I discovered that pure listening has several powerful effects. First, it makes people feel valued and important. In a world where everyone is eager to speak and few are willing to truly listen. The person who offers genuine attention becomes incredibly influential. Second, it allows people to process their own thoughts and often discover their own solutions. Third, it builds trust and emotional connection in ways that sharing information never can. Learning to listen instead of correct also revealed something surprising about influence. I found that people were far more open to my insights and expertise after they felt heard and understood. When I demonstrated that I cared about their perspective before sharing my own, they became remarkably receptive to my input. There's a technique I developed that I call the listening pause. Whenever someone shares something that triggers my urge to correct or add information, I pause and ask myself, what is this person really trying to communicate to me? Often, the surface content of their words is less important than the underlying message they're trying to convey. For example, when someone tells you about their vacation and gets some historical facts wrong about the places they visited, they're not really trying to educate you about history. They're trying to share their excitement, connect with you through their experience, and perhaps receive some acknowledgement of their adventure. Correcting their facts completely misses the point of their communication. I learned to respond to the spirit of what people were sharing rather than the technical accuracy of their words. This doesn't mean becoming intellectually dishonest or accepting falsehoods. It means understanding that most conversations are about connection first and information second. The practice of listening instead of correcting became one of my most powerful relationship tools. It transformed my marriage, deepened my friendships, and revolutionized my ability to help others. I discovered that when you truly listen to people, they tell you exactly what they need from you, and it's rarely correction or additional information. Instead, they need understanding, encouragement, validation, or simply the comfort of knowing they're not alone in their struggles. When we provide what people actually need rather than what we think they should have, we become genuinely influential in their lives. This shift from correcting to connecting, from proving intelligence to demonstrating care, became the foundation of everything I would later teach about winning friends and influencing people. One of the most counterintuitive lessons I learned about influence is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. I discovered that strategic silence, knowing when not to speak, when not to correct, when not to add your voice to a conversation, can be more influential than the most eloquent speech or the most accurate correction. This realization came to me during a business meeting where I witnessed something remarkable. A senior executive named William was listening to a younger colleague present an idea that contained several factual errors and questionable assumptions. I watched William's face as he clearly recognized these mistakes, saw him open his mouth to speak, then pause and remain silent. After the presentation, instead of correcting the errors publicly, William approached the young man privately. "I found your presentation thought-provoking," he said. "I'd love to explore some of these ideas further with you. Would you be willing to meet with me next week to dive deeper into your research?" During their private meeting, William didn't lead with corrections. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions that guided the young man to discover the flaws in his own reasoning. By the end of their conversation, the colleague had identified the errors himself and was grateful for William's mentorship rather than resentful of his criticism. I was fascinated by William's approach. His silence in the public meeting preserved the young man's dignity, while his private questions provided the guidance needed for improvement. William had chosen influence over being right, relationship over correction, and the result was profound impact rather than momentary satisfaction. This taught me that silence is not passive. It's a strategic choice that often requires more strength than speaking. It takes tremendous self-discipline to remain quiet when you know you could dazzle others with your knowledge, or when you could immediately correct a mistake. But I learned that this restraint often creates more powerful outcomes than immediate correction. There's what I call the wisdom pause. That moment when you recognize you have something to add to a conversation but choose to wait, to observe, to see what unfolds naturally. During this pause, remarkable things happen. People often discover their own insights. Conversations take unexpected and valuable directions. Others in the group step up to contribute ideas they might never have shared if you had immediately filled the silence with your expertise. I began experimenting with strategic silence in various situations. When someone told a story with factual inaccuracies, instead of correcting them, I focused on the emotions they were trying to convey and responded to those. When colleagues made decisions I believed were suboptimal, instead of immediately offering better alternatives, I asked questions that helped them think through the implications themselves. The results consistently surprised me. People began seeking my counsel more frequently because they felt safe exploring ideas in my presence without immediate judgment. My influence grew not because I spoke more, but because I spoke more thoughtfully. When I did choose to share my knowledge, people listened more intently because they had learned that my contributions were carefully considered rather than reflexive. I discovered that silence serves several powerful functions in relationships. First, it creates space for others to think, process, and contribute their own insights. Many people need processing time to formulate their thoughts, and constant input from others can shut down their thinking before it fully develops. Second, silence demonstrates respect for others' intelligence and autonomy. When we immediately jump in with corrections or additions, we unconsciously communicate that we don't trust others to reach good conclusions on their own. Strategic silence says, I believe in your ability to work through this. Third, silence often creates what I call discovery ownership. When people figure something out for themselves, rather than being told, they own that insight in a way that creates lasting change. Information we discover ourselves becomes integrated into our thinking much more deeply than information we're simply given. I learned to distinguish between helpful silence and neglectful silence. Helpful silence is strategic. It serves the other person's development and the relationship's health. Neglectful silence is simply disengagement or withholding information that someone genuinely needs. The key is understanding what the moment requires. Sometimes silence means biting your tongue. When someone mispronounces a word in casual conversation, sometimes it means allowing a colleague to work through a problem themselves before offering assistance. Sometimes it means not sharing the perfect solution immediately so that others can contribute their own ideas. The practice of strategic silence transformed my reputation from someone who always had something to say to someone whose words carried special weight when spoken. People began to lean in when I spoke because they knew I chose my words carefully. My silence became as influential as my speech, creating space for others to shine while building my own credibility as someone who understood the power of restraint. This doesn't mean becoming passive or failing to contribute when your expertise is truly needed. It means developing the wisdom to know when speaking serves others and when silence serves them better. If I could teach the world only one principle about human relationships, it would be this: every person you meet is carrying a sign that reads, "Make me feel important." This invisible sign hangs around every human being's neck, and learning to see it and respond to it transformed not only my relationships, but my entire understanding of influence and leadership. The tragedy I witnessed over and over in my work was brilliant people who could solve complex problems, analyze intricate data, and provide expert solutions, yet couldn't understand why others resisted their help or avoided their company. The missing piece was their failure to recognize and respond to others' fundamental need for significance. I learned this lesson through a painful experience with my own father. He was a practical, hard-working farmer who had built our family's life through determination and common sense. When I returned from New York after gaining some success in teaching and business, I was eager to share my newfound knowledge with him. I remember walking through his fields, pointing out more efficient farming techniques I had read about, suggesting better ways to organize his equipment, and offering insights about agricultural economics that I had learned from books and city experts. I was sharing valuable information, and I was technically correct about most of my suggestions, but I noticed my father growing quieter and more distant with each helpful observation. Finally, he stopped walking and looked at me with sadness in his eyes. "Son," he said, "I've been farming this land for 30 years. I've fed our family, sent you to school, and built everything we have with these methods you're criticizing. Maybe my ways aren't perfect, but they've served me well." In that moment, I realized what I had done. In my eagerness to be helpful and share my knowledge, I had inadvertently communicated that his life's work was inferior, that his methods were inadequate, that his experience was less valuable than my book learning. I had made him feel small when I should have made him feel honored that day. I learned to look for opportunities to acknowledge others' expertise, experience, and contributions before sharing my own insights. Instead of leading with corrections, I began leading with appreciation. Instead of highlighting what people were doing wrong, I started highlighting what they were doing right. The transformation in my relationships was immediate and profound. When I changed my approach with my father, expressing genuine admiration for his agricultural wisdom and asking questions about his methods, he became eager to hear my ideas. He began asking me about new techniques and considering my suggestions, not because I had proven him wrong, but because I had first proven that I respected him. I discovered that making others feel important doesn't require false flattery or dishonest praise. It requires genuine attention to the value, effort, and contributions that exist in every person's life. Everyone has something they do well, something they've overcome, something they can teach others. When we learn to see and acknowledge these things, we unlock people's openness to our influence. There's a technique I developed that I call the spotlight principle. Instead of shining the spotlight on my own knowledge and expertise, I learned to shine it on others' accomplishments, insights, and experiences. When someone shared an idea, instead of immediately adding my own thoughts, I would ask questions that helped them elaborate on their thinking. When someone made a good point, I would explicitly acknowledge it before building upon it. I found that people have an almost infinite capacity to grow and improve when they feel valued and appreciated. But when they feel diminished or criticized, they become defensive and resistant to change. The same suggestion that would be rejected when delivered as criticism would be embraced when delivered as a building upon something they were already doing well. In my business relationships, I learned to begin meetings by acknowledging others' contributions before introducing new ideas. In my teaching, I learned to highlight students' strengths before addressing areas for improvement. In my marriage, I learned to express appreciation for my wife's unique qualities before discussing any concerns. The key insight is that feeling important is not the same as feeling superior. When we make others feel important, we're not diminishing ourselves. We're creating an environment where everyone can contribute their best. People who feel valued become more generous, more creative, more willing to take risks and try new approaches. I also discovered that making others feel important often reveals capabilities and insights that would otherwise remain hidden. When people feel safe and valued, they share ideas they might never have offered if they felt judged or inadequate. Some of my best business decisions came from insights shared by people who initially felt too intimidated to speak up. This principle transformed my public speaking as well. Instead of focusing on impressing audiences with my knowledge, I began focusing on making them feel capable and valuable. I would acknowledge their challenges, celebrate their efforts, and position my teachings as tools to help them achieve their own goals rather than evidence of my expertise. The result was audiences who felt empowered rather than educated, inspired rather than informed. They left my presentations feeling better about themselves rather than impressed with me, and this made them far more likely to implement what they had learned. Making others feel important became the foundation of all my work in human relations. It's not a technique or strategy, it's a fundamental orientation toward recognizing and honoring the inherent worth and dignity of every person you encounter. When you master this principle, you'll find that people naturally want to be around you, listen to you, and follow your guidance, not because you've proven your superiority, but because you've proven your appreciation for theirs. One of the most sophisticated skills I developed in my study of human relations was the ability to disagree without being disagreeable, to challenge ideas while honoring the person who holds them. This skill became essential because completely avoiding disagreement is neither possible nor desirable, but the way we handle disagreement often determines whether we build relationships or destroy them. I learned this principle through observing a masterful negotiator named Samuel, who worked in labor relations during some of the most contentious strikes of the early 1900s. Samuel had to regularly tell union leaders and company executives that their positions were unrealistic, their demands were unfair, or their strategies were counterproductive. Yet both sides respected him and sought his counsel. I studied Samuel's approach carefully and discovered his secret. He never made people wrong as human beings, even when he disagreed with their ideas. He had developed a vocabulary and methodology that separated the person from their position, the individual from their idea, the human being from their current thinking. Instead of saying, "You're wrong about this," Samuel would say, "I see this differently, and let me share why." Instead of, "That's a terrible idea," he would say, "I appreciate your thinking on this, and I'd like to offer another perspective." Instead of, "You don't understand the situation," he would say, "Let me share some additional information that might be relevant." These weren't just diplomatic word games, they reflected a fundamental shift in how Samuel approached disagreement. He genuinely separated his respect for the person from his disagreement with their position. This allowed him to challenge ideas vigorously while maintaining and even strengthening relationships. I began experimenting with this approach in my own life and discovered that it required a complete reframing of what disagreement means. Instead of viewing disagreement as a battle to be won, I learned to see it as a collaboration to find truth or the best solution. Instead of trying to prove the other person wrong, I focused on exploring different perspectives together. The technique I developed involves what I call the dignity bridge, a way of transitioning from their position to your position that honors their thinking process. It might sound like, "I can see why you would think that. Given your experience with X, I've had some different experiences that have led me to a different conclusion, and I'd love to share them with you." This approach acknowledges that their position makes sense from their perspective while creating space for your different viewpoint. It assumes intelligence and good intentions on their part, while introducing your alternative perspective as additional information rather than correction. I found that this method works because it addresses the emotional dynamic underneath disagreement. When people feel that their intelligence or judgment is being attacked, they become defensive and close-minded. But when they feel that their perspective is understood and respected, even if not shared, they remain open to new information and alternative viewpoints. One of the most powerful phrases I learned to use was "help me understand your thinking on this." This invitation to explain their reasoning served multiple purposes. First, it often revealed information or perspectives I hadn't considered, sometimes changing my own position. Second, it made them feel respected and heard. Third, it gave me insight into their values and priorities, which helped me frame my alternative perspective in terms they would find compelling. Also discovered the importance of finding points of agreement before introducing points of disagreement. Even in situations where I strongly disagreed with someone's overall position, I could usually find some aspect of their thinking that I could genuinely affirm. Starting with these agreements created a foundation of connection that made the disagreements feel less threatening. For example, if someone proposed a business strategy I thought was flawed, I might begin by saying, "I really appreciate your focus on customer satisfaction. That's absolutely the right priority. I have some thoughts about the implementation approach that might help us achieve that goal even more effectively." This technique, which I called yes and rather than no, but transformed my ability to influence others during disagreements. Instead of feeling attacked and becoming defensive, people felt heard and became curious about my perspective. I learned that diplomatic disagreement also requires careful attention to timing and setting. Private conversations almost always work better than public disagreements for preserving relationships. People can accept being wrong much more easily when they don't have to lose face in front of others. The most challenging aspect of diplomatic disagreement is managing your own emotions. When someone says something you believe is incorrect, harmful, or misguided, your natural instinct is to correct them immediately and forcefully. Learning to pause, breathe, and respond thoughtfully, rather than react emotionally, took years of practice, but the results were worth the effort. I found that people were far more likely to consider my perspectives when I disagreed diplomatically. They began seeking my input on difficult decisions because they knew I could challenge their thinking without attacking their character. My influence grew not despite my disagreements, but because of how I handled them. The art of diplomatic disagreement became one of my most valuable skills in business, teaching, and personal relationships. It allowed me to maintain strong connections with people while still being able to share my honest thoughts and perspectives when they differed from theirs. One of the most counterintuitive discoveries of my career was that admitting when I was wrong actually increased rather than decreased my influence and credibility. For years, I had operated under the assumption that leaders and experts must project infallibility, that admitting mistakes would undermine my authority and make others lose confidence in my guidance. This belief was shattered during a public speaking engagement in Chicago, where I made a significant factual error while addressing a group of business leaders. I had cited statistics about industrial productivity that I later realized were outdated and incorrect. A member of the audience, who was an expert in that field, politely but firmly corrected me during the question period. My first instinct was to defend my position, to find some way to save face or minimize the error, but something inside me rebelled against this impulse. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "You're absolutely right, and I apologize for the misinformation. I was working from outdated data, and I should have verified those statistics before presenting them. Thank you for the correctional. Make sure to get the accurate figures for future presentations." The response in that room was immediate and unexpected. Instead of losing credibility, I seemed to gain it. People leaned forward with increased attention. Several audience members approached me afterward, not to criticize my error, but to express appreciation for my honesty and to share their own experiences with similar mistakes. That evening taught me that admitting mistakes doesn't make you appear weak, it makes you appear human. And humans, I discovered, are far more likely to trust, follow, and respect other humans than they are to trust someone who claims to be infallible. I began studying this phenomenon more carefully and found that the most influential leaders throughout history were often those who could acknowledge their errors with grace and learn from them publicly. This vulnerability didn't diminish their authority. It enhanced it by making them more relatable and trustworthy. The key insight I developed is that there's a profound difference between admitting mistakes and appearing incompetent. When you admit a mistake with confidence, taking responsibility without making excuses. You demonstrate several powerful qualities: integrity, self-awareness, courage, and commitment to truth over ego. I learned to distinguish between different types of mistakes and how to handle each appropriately. Factual errors, like my statistics mistake, required immediate, clear correction. Errors in judgment required acknowledgement and explanation of what I had learned. Interpersonal mistakes required both admission and sincere apology to those affected. The most transformative aspect of this approach was how it changed my relationship with my own perfectionism. When I stopped needing to be right all the time, I became more willing to take intellectual risks, explore new ideas, and engage with topics where I wasn't an expert. This intellectual courage actually made me more knowledgeable and effective, not less. I also discovered that admitting mistakes created what I call permission culture around me. When people saw that I could acknowledge errors without catastrophic consequences, they became more willing to admit their own mistakes, ask questions when they were confused, and take creative risks that might not work out perfectly. In my marriage, this principle revolutionized our communication. Instead of defending myself when Lolita pointed out something I had done thoughtlessly, I learned to say, "You're right, and I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking about how that would affect you." These simple acknowledgments, which cost me nothing but pride, transformed conflicts into conversations and criticism into connection. One of my most powerful business experiences came when I made a significant strategic error in expanding our training programs too quickly without adequate preparation. Instead of making excuses or blaming external factors, I called a meeting with my team and said, "I made a mistake in judgment, and it's created problems for all of us. Here's what I learned from this error, and here's how we're going to fix it." The response was remarkable. Instead of losing confidence in my leadership, my team rallied around our recovery efforts. They began bringing problems to me more quickly because they knew I wouldn't shoot the messenger or deny reality. Our organization became more agile and innovative because people weren't afraid of making honest mistakes. I developed what I call the mistake protocol, a systematic way of handling errors that maximizes learning and minimizes damage to relationships. First, acknowledge the mistake clearly and specifically. Second, take full responsibility without excuses or blame shifting. Third, explain what you've learned from the error. Fourth, outline your plan to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Fifth, thank anyone who helped identify or correct the mistake. This approach transformed mistakes from sources of shame into opportunities for growth and connection. People began to see my willingness to admit errors as a sign of strength rather than weakness, wisdom rather than ignorance. The ultimate irony I discovered is that by becoming comfortable with being wrong occasionally, I actually became right more often. When you're not invested in defending every position, you can evaluate new information more objectively. When you're not afraid of changing your mind, you can follow evidence wherever it leads. When you're not committed to infallibility, you can learn from every experience. Admitting mistakes became one of my most powerful tools for building trust, modeling intellectual humility, and creating environments where everyone could learn and grow together. In all my years of studying persuasion and influence, I discovered that the most powerful conversations don't begin with where people disagree, they begin with where people agree. This principle, which I came to call common ground first, became the foundation of my approach to handling conflicts, negotiations, and any situation where I needed to influence someone who initially held a different view. The revelation came to me during a heated community meeting about a proposed railroad expansion through our town. Neighbors who had been friends for years were shouting at each other across the room. Property owners wanted the economic benefits, while others feared the disruption to our quiet community. The meeting was devolving into personal attacks and bitter divisions. I watched the town mayor, a wise man named Henderson, step to the front of the room. Instead of addressing the disagreement directly, he began by saying, "I think we can all agree that we love this town and want what's best for our families and our future. We all want our children to have opportunities, and we all want to preserve what makes our community special." The room grew quiet. People who had been glaring at each other moments before found themselves nodding in agreement. Mayor Henderson had found the common ground that everyone shared, despite their different conclusions about the railroad. From that foundation of agreement, the conversation transformed. Instead of arguing about who was right or wrong, people began exploring how to achieve their shared goals. They discussed ways to capture economic benefits while preserving community character. They found creative solutions that no one had considered when they were focused on their disagreements. This experience taught me that common ground serves as emotional and intellectual foundation for productive dialogue. When people feel aligned on fundamental values and goals, they become collaborators in problem solving rather than adversaries in debate. I began applying this principle in my business relationships with remarkable results. When meeting with potential clients who were skeptical of my training programs, instead of immediately defending my methods or proving my expertise, I would begin by exploring our shared concerns about communication, effectiveness, and business success. I might say something like, "I imagine we both want your team to feel confident when they're presenting ideas, and we both want your communication to drive better business results. Is that right?" Starting from this common ground, we could then explore how my programs might serve those shared objectives. The psychological principle behind this approach is what I call yes momentum. When people say yes to several statements in a row, they become psychologically inclined to continue agreeing. But more importantly, when they feel understood and aligned with you on fundamental issues, they become more open to considering your perspective on areas where you might initially disagree. I discovered that finding common ground requires genuine curiosity about others' values and motivations. You can't manufacture artificial agreement. You must look for authentic areas of alignment. This often meant asking questions like, "What's most important to you about this situation?" Or "What outcome would make you feel most satisfied?" In my marriage, this principle transformed how Lolita and I handled disagreements. Instead of immediately debating our different preferences about household decisions or social plans, I learned to first identify what we both wanted to achieve. Usually, we both wanted our home to be comfortable, our social life to be enjoyable, and our decisions to reflect our shared values. From that foundation of agreement, our different approaches became options to evaluate rather than positions to defend. We could discuss the merits of various approaches without either of us feeling attacked or misunderstood. One of my most challenging applications of this principle came when dealing with a business partner who wanted to take our company in a direction I thought was misguided. Instead of immediately arguing against his plan, I spent time understanding his vision and finding the aspects I genuinely supported. I discovered that we both wanted the company to grow, both valued our employees' well-being, and both wanted to maintain our reputation for quality service. Once we established this common ground, I could share my concerns about his specific strategy as alternative ways to achieve our shared goals, rather than as criticisms of his judgment. The conversation became collaborative rather than adversarial. He became open to modifying his approach, and I became open to aspects of his plan that I had initially rejected. We developed a hybrid strategy that served our common objectives better than either of our original ideas. I learned that finding common ground doesn't mean avoiding difficult conversations or pretending disagreements don't exist. It means creating the relationship foundation that makes those difficult conversations productive rather than destructive. There's an art to identifying genuine common ground versus superficial similarities, Authentic common ground usually involves shared values, mutual concerns, or aligned objectives. Superficial similarities might involve shared experiences or preferences that don't relate to the issue at hand. The most powerful common ground often exists at a higher level than the immediate disagreement. Two people might disagree about a specific business strategy while sharing common ground about wanting the business to succeed. They might disagree about parenting techniques while sharing common ground about wanting their children to thrive. This principle became essential in my public speaking and teaching. Instead of beginning with my expertise or my different approach, I would start by acknowledging the challenges my audience faced and the results they wanted to achieve. This created immediate connection and made them receptive to my guidance. Finding common ground first became my secret weapon for turning potential adversaries into allies, conflicts into collaborations, and disagreements into discoveries of better solutions than either party had originally considered. Perhaps the most profound shift in my understanding of human nature came when I realized that people are not primarily logical beings who occasionally feel emotions. They are emotional beings who occasionally think logically. This insight revolutionized my approach to influence and revealed why being factually correct often fails to change minds or behaviors. The breakthrough came during my work with a brilliant engineer named Thomas, who was struggling in his leadership role despite having superior technical knowledge. Thomas would present flawless analyses, provide mathematically sound solutions, and offer logically impeccable recommendations. Yet his team consistently resisted his guidance, and his superiors questioned his leadership potential. I observed Thomas in several meetings and noticed a pattern. He would listen to his team's concerns, then immediately respond with data and logic that proved their worries were unfounded. When team members expressed frustration about workload, he would show them efficiency calculations, proving they could handle more. When they raised concerns about project timelines, he would present scheduling data that demonstrated the deadlines were reasonable. Thomas was always right in his facts, but he was completely wrong in his approach. He was trying to solve emotional problems with logical solutions, addressing feelings with facts. His team didn't feel heard, understood, or valued. They felt analyzed, dismissed, and reduced to variables in his equations. I began working with Thomas to help him understand what I came to call emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and appropriately respond to emotions in himself and others. This wasn't about becoming emotional rather than logical, but about understanding that emotions are data that must be processed before logic can be effectively applied. The transformation began when Thomas learned to acknowledge emotions before addressing facts. Instead of immediately countering his team's concerns with data, he started saying things like, "I can see you're feeling overwhelmed by the current workload, and that's a real concern we need to address." This simple acknowledgement of their emotional reality made them receptive to his logical solutions. I discovered that emotional intelligence involves several key components. First is emotional awareness, recognizing emotions in yourself and others as they arise. Second is emotional understanding, grasping why those emotions exist and what they're communicating. Third is emotional management, responding to emotions appropriately rather than being controlled by them or dismissing them entirely. In my own life, developing emotional intelligence meant learning to pause when I felt the urge to correct someone and asking myself, what might this person be feeling right now, and why? Often, I discovered that their incorrect statement was actually an expression of frustration, confusion, fear, or hope that had little to do with the factual content of their words. For example, when someone would say, "This new policy will never work," they weren't necessarily making a logical prediction about policy effectiveness. They might be expressing anxiety about change, frustration about not being consulted, or fear about how the policy would affect them personally. Responding to their emotional concern was far more effective than defending the policy's merits. I learned that emotions serve as the gateway to the logical mind. When people feel understood and validated emotionally, they become open to considering new information and perspectives. But when their emotions are dismissed or ignored, they become defensive and closed-minded. Regardless of how compelling your logic might be, this insight transformed my teaching approach. Instead of beginning classes with information and techniques, I started by acknowledging the challenges and feelings my students brought with them. I know many of you are nervous about public speaking, and that's completely understandable. It's one of the most common fears people have. By addressing their emotional reality first, I created the psychological safety necessary for learning. Students who had been too anxious to absorb information suddenly became eager to learn techniques that would help them manage their nervousness and build confidence. I also discovered that emotional intelligence requires what I call emotional honesty, the willingness to acknowledge and work with emotions rather than pretending they don't exist or shouldn't matter. In business settings, this meant recognizing that decisions aren't made purely on logical criteria. People's feelings about a proposal, their comfort with change, their confidence in leadership, and their sense of being valued all influence their responses. One of my most challenging applications of emotional intelligence came in dealing with my own tendency toward impatience and frustration when others couldn't grasp concepts that seemed obvious to me. I had to learn to manage my own emotions before I could effectively respond to others. Emotions, I developed what I call the emotional pause, a moment of self-awareness when I felt strong emotions arising, where I would ask myself, what am I feeling right now, and why? What might the other person be feeling, and why? How can I respond in a way that addresses both sets of emotions constructively? This pause often revealed that my impatience stemmed from my own insecurity about being seen as a good teacher, while their confusion stemmed from feeling overwhelmed or afraid of looking stupid. Understanding these emotional dynamics allowed me to respond with patience and encouragement rather than frustration. Emotional intelligence also taught me the power of emotional contagion, the way emotions spread from person to person. When I remained calm and confident in difficult situations, others around me became calmer and more confident. When I expressed genuine enthusiasm for possibilities, others became more optimistic about outcomes. The most profound realization was that emotional intelligence doesn't replace logical thinking, enhances it. When you understand and address the emotional dimensions of a situation, people become more capable of engaging their logical faculties. When emotions are acknowledged and managed appropriately, better thinking and better decisions naturally follow. This integration of emotional and logical intelligence became the cornerstone of everything I taught about winning friends and influencing people. It revealed why technical expertise alone is insufficient for leadership and why being right about facts is meaningless if you're wrong about feelings. Throughout my career, I observed two distinct types of people: those who built others up and those who tore others down. The difference between them wasn't intelligence, education, or expertise. It was a fundamental choice about how to relate to other human beings. This choice, I discovered, determines not only the quality of your relationships, but the extent of your influence and impact in the world. The contrast became crystal clear to me through watching two managers at a company where I was conducting training. Both were highly competent professionals with similar backgrounds and responsibilities. Both worked with teams that made regular mistakes and faced ongoing challenges. The first manager, whom I'll call Richardson, had developed what I recognized as a correction-focused approach. When team members made errors, Richardson would point them out immediately and thoroughly. When someone's work was substandard, Richardson would explain in detail what was wrong, and how to do it correctly. When meetings revealed gaps in knowledge or preparation, Richardson would identify these deficiencies and provide the missing information. Richardson was always right in his corrections. His feedback was accurate, his standards were high, and his knowledge was extensive. Yet his team was demoralized, cautious, and increasingly reluctant to take initiative or share ideas. The second manager, whom I'll call Patterson, took what I came to call a construction-focused approach. When team members made errors, Patterson would first acknowledge what they had done well, then guide them toward better approaches. When someone's work needed improvement, Patterson would highlight the strong elements before addressing the areas for development. When meetings revealed knowledge gaps, Patterson would frame them as learning opportunities rather than failures. Patterson's team was energetic, creative, and constantly seeking ways to improve their performance. They brought problems to Patterson early because they knew they would be met with support rather than criticism. They took calculated risks because they trusted that mistakes would be treated as learning experiences rather than character judgments. Both managers achieved their objectives, but Patterson's team consistently outperformed Richardson's in productivity, innovation, and morale. The difference was not in the standards they held or the feedback they provided, but in how they delivered that feedback. This observation led me to develop what I call the construction principle. Human beings flourish when they feel built up and wither when they feel torn down. This isn't about avoiding difficult conversations or lowering standards. It's about understanding that the same information can be delivered in ways that either strengthen or diminish the recipient. I began experimenting with this principle in my own teaching and relationships. Instead of beginning with what students were doing wrong, I started with what they were doing right. Instead of highlighting gaps in their knowledge, I celebrated their progress and framed areas for improvement as natural next steps in their development. The transformation was remarkable. Students who had been defensive and discouraged became eager and confident. They began taking bigger risks in their learning because they trusted that their efforts would be acknowledged, even when their results were imperfect. In my marriage, this principle revolutionized how Lolita and I communicated about household responsibilities, social decisions, and personal habits. Instead of pointing out what wasn't working, I learned to appreciate what was working and then suggest adjustments that would make good things even better. For example, instead of saying, "You forgot to pay the electric bill again," I would say, "I really appreciate how well you manage all our household finances. I noticed the electric bill might need attention. Would it help if I took over that particular payment to make your load lighter?" The difference in Lolita's response was dramatic. Instead of becoming defensive about her oversight, she felt supported and appreciated. She became more open to discussing how we could work together more effectively. I discovered that building others up requires genuine attention to their positive qualities, efforts, and achievements. This isn't about false praise or ignoring problems. It's about developing the ability to see and acknowledge the good that exists alongside the areas that need improvement. There's a technique I developed called the appreciation bridge. Before addressing any concern or correction, I would identify something genuine to appreciate about the person or their efforts. This appreciation created emotional safety that made them receptive to feedback and suggestions for improvement. The bridge might sound like, "I really admire your commitment to getting this project right. You've put a lot of thought into it. I have some ideas that might help you achieve the results you're looking for even more effectively." This approach acknowledges their positive intentions and efforts before introducing suggestions, making the feedback feel supportive rather than critical. I learned that building others up requires careful attention to language. Words have the power to either lift people's spirits or crush them. Phrases like "that's wrong" can be replaced with "here's another way to think about it." "You don't understand" can become "let me explain this differently." "You made a mistake" can become here's what we can learn from this experience. The construction principle also applies to how we frame people's potential. Instead of focusing on their current limitations, I learned to speak to their future possibilities. Instead of saying, "You're not good at public speaking," I would say, "You have the potential to become a compelling speaker with some practice and technique." This shift in language reflects a deeper shift in perspective, from seeing people as fixed entities with permanent limitations to seeing them as growing beings with unlimited potential for development. The most profound aspect of this principle is its self-reinforcing nature. When you consistently build others up, they begin to see themselves as capable of growth and improvement. This self-perception leads to increased effort, greater risk-taking, and accelerated development. They become what you help them believe they can become. Building others up instead of tearing them down became one of my most powerful tools for creating positive change in people's lives and for developing the kind of relationships that make life meaningful and fulfilling. One of the most powerful discoveries in my study of influence was that questions are often more persuasive than statements, more effective than arguments, and more influential than expert declarations. The person who masters the art of asking the right questions at the right time wields a form of leadership that creates genuine understanding and lasting change. This insight came to me through watching a remarkable school principal named Mrs. Henderson, who had to address a serious problem with student behavior at her school. Instead of implementing new rules or delivering lectures about proper conduct, she called an assembly and began with a simple question: "What kind of school do you want this to be?" The students, expecting to be scolded, were caught off guard by being asked for their input. As they began sharing their vision of an ideal school environment, something magical happened. They started describing exactly the behaviors and atmosphere that Mrs. Henderson wanted to create. But in their own words and from their own motivation, Mrs. Henderson continued with questions like, what would need to change for our school to become that kind of place? And what role could each of you play in creating the school you've described? By the end of the assembly, the students had essentially designed their own behavior improvement plan, feeling ownership and excitement about changes they might have resisted if imposed from above. I realized that Mrs. Henderson had discovered something profound about human psychology. People support what they help create. When you tell someone what to think or do, you're asking them to subordinate their judgment to yours. But when you ask questions that guide them to discover insights for themselves, they own those insights in a way that creates lasting change. Began experimenting with this approach in my own teaching and consulting work. Instead of beginning presentations with my conclusions and recommendations, I started with questions that helped audiences think through the issues themselves. Instead of telling business clients what they should do, I asked questions that guided them to discover better approaches. The transformation was remarkable. People became more engaged, more thoughtful, and more committed to implementing insights they had discovered through their own thinking process. They stopped seeing me as someone trying to impose ideas on them and started seeing me as someone helping them think more clearly about their challenges. I developed what I call the discovery method, a systematic approach to using questions to guide people toward insights and solutions. The method involves several types of questions, each serving a different purpose in the thinking process. Exploration questions help people examine their current situation. What's working well in your current approach? What challenges are you facing? What have you tried so far? These questions help both you and them understand the full context. Before jumping to solutions, clarification questions help people think more precisely about their goals and priorities. What would success look like in this situation? What's most important to you about the outcome? What are you hoping to achieve? These questions ensure that any solutions you explore together are aligned with what they actually want. Implication questions help people think through the consequences of different approaches. What might happen if you continued with your current strategy. How do you think your team would respond to that change? What could be the long-term effects of this decision? These questions help people evaluate options more thoroughly. Solution questions guide people toward discovering their own answers. What options do you see for addressing this challenge? What approach do you think might work best? What would need to be true for this strategy to succeed? These questions help people take ownership of solutions. Rather than feeling like solutions are being imposed on them, I learned that the art of questioning requires genuine curiosity rather than manipulation. When you ask questions because you're truly interested in understanding someone's perspective and helping them think more clearly, they sense your authentic care. But when you ask questions as a manipulative technique to lead them to predetermined conclusions, they sense your agenda and become resistant. In my marriage, this approach transformed how we made decisions together. Instead of presenting Lolita with my analysis of what we should do about household issues, travel plans, or financial decisions, I began asking questions that helped us explore the situation together. For example, instead of saying, "We should refinance our mortgage because interest rates have dropped," I might ask, "What do you think about our current mortgage situation? Are you satisfied with our monthly payments? Have you noticed anything about interest rates lately?" This approach led to conversations where we discovered solutions together rather than debates where I tried to convince her of my predetermined conclusion. The questioning approach also revolutionized my public speaking. Instead of lecturing audiences about communication principles, I began asking questions that helped them reflect on their own experiences. How many of you have ever felt nervous before giving a presentation? What do you think makes some speakers more engaging than others? When you're listening to someone speak, what captures your attention? These questions created immediate engagement and made the audience active participants in their own learning rather than passive recipients of my expertise. They began sharing insights from their own experience that enriched the entire group's understanding. I discovered that leading through questions requires patience and restraint. When you know the answer to a question, it's tempting to provide it quickly rather than giving others time to think through the issue themselves. But the thinking process is often more valuable than the answer itself, because it develops people's ability to solve similar problems in the future. The most profound aspect of the questioning approach is that it demonstrates respect for others' intelligence and judgment. When you ask someone a thoughtful question, you're implying that they have the capacity to think through complex issues and reach sound conclusions. This respect creates trust and opens people to influence in ways that direct instruction never can. Leading through questions became one of my most effective tools for creating genuine change in people's thinking and behavior, while building the kind of respectful relationships that make leadership both possible and meaningful. The most sophisticated level of influence I achieved came when I learned to move beyond being right or wrong, beyond winning or losing, to a realm where everyone could succeed together. This shift from competitive thinking to collaborative thinking transformed not only my relationships, but my entire approach to business, teaching, and life. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging negotiation between a factory owner and his workers, who were threatening to strike. I had been called in to help mediate the dispute, and both sides came to the table convinced that the other side's demands were unreasonable and that only one party could prevail. The factory owner believed he couldn't afford the wage increases the workers demanded without bankrupting the company. The workers believed they couldn't support their families on their current wages, and that the owner was simply being greedy. Each side had prepared arguments to prove why they were right and the other side was wrong. As I listened to both presentations, I realized that everyone was focused on the positions they had taken rather than the underlying interests they were trying to serve. The owner wasn't being greedy. He was genuinely worried about the company's survival and his ability to keep providing jobs. The workers weren't being unreasonable. They were struggling to feed their families and create security for their futures, instead of trying to determine who was right about wages. I began asking questions that helped both sides understand what they really needed. What would need to be true for this company to thrive and provide long-term job security? What would need to happen for the workers to feel confident about their financial future? As we explored these deeper questions, something remarkable emerged. Both sides wanted the same thing: a successful, profitable company that could provide good jobs and fair compensation over the long term. Their conflict wasn't really about competing interests. It was about different ideas for achieving their shared objective. Once we established this common ground, we could begin exploring creative solutions that served everyone's interests. Instead of simply arguing about wage levels, we discussed profit-sharing arrangements, productivity bonuses, and efficiency improvements that could increase both worker compensation and company profitability. The final agreement included modest, immediate wage increases, performance-based bonuses tied to productivity improvements, and a profit-sharing plan that gave workers a stake in the company's success. Both sides achieved more than they had originally thought possible because we had moved from adversarial negotiation to collaborative problem-solving. This experience taught me what I came to call the abundance principle, the understanding that most situations contain enough value to satisfy everyone's essential needs if we're creative enough to find it. The scarcity thinking that drives win-lose mentality often blinds us to possibilities that could benefit everyone involved. I began applying this principle in all areas of my life and work. In business partnerships, instead of negotiating for the largest possible share of existing value, I focused on finding ways to create more value that we could all share. In teaching relationships, instead of positioning myself as the expert who had knowledge that students lacked, I created learning environments where everyone could contribute insights and everyone could grow. The key to creating win-win solutions is understanding the difference between positions and interests. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are why they want it. When people argue about positions, conflict is inevitable because positions often appear mutually exclusive. But when you understand underlying interests, you can often find creative ways to satisfy everyone's fundamental needs. I learned to ask questions that revealed interests behind positions. What's most important to you about this outcome? What are you hoping to achieve? What concerns you most about the alternatives? These questions help people move beyond their initial demands to explore what they really need. In my marriage, this approach revolutionized how we handled disagreements about everything from household decisions to social plans. Instead of debating whose preference should prevail, we learned to explore what each of us was trying to achieve and find approaches that honored both sets of needs. For example, when we disagreed about vacation plans, instead of arguing about destinations, we discussed what we each hoped to get from our time away. Lolita wanted relaxation and beautiful scenery. I wanted intellectual stimulation and cultural experiences. Once we understood these underlying interests, we could plan trips that included both restful beach time and interesting historical sites. The win-win approach also transformed my business relationships. Instead of trying to extract maximum value from deals, I focused on creating arrangements that made all parties eager to work together again. This long-term thinking led to stronger partnerships, better referrals, and more sustainable success than any short-term advantage could have provided. I discovered that creating win-win solutions requires what I call expanded thinking, the ability to see beyond the obvious options to possibilities that might not be immediately apparent. This often involves challenging assumptions about what's fixed versus what's flexible, what's essential versus what's preferred, and what's possible versus what's traditional. The most profound aspect of win-win thinking is that it changes your relationship with other people from potential adversaries to potential allies. When people sense that you're genuinely committed to finding solutions that serve everyone's interests, they become more open, more creative, and more willing to share information that leads to breakthrough solutions. This collaborative approach became the foundation of my most successful relationships and ventures. It taught me that the ultimate expression of influence isn't getting others to do what you want, it's creating situations where everyone can achieve what they need, while contributing to something larger than any individual agenda. Win-win thinking transformed me from someone who tried to be right into someone who tried to be helpful, from someone who sought to win into someone who sought to create value for everyone involved. As I reflect on my life's work and the countless relationships I've been privileged to influence, I'm struck by a profound truth. No one remembers you for being right, but everyone remembers you for how you made them feel. The legacy we leave isn't built on the accuracy of our facts or the correctness of our positions, but on the impact we have on other human beings. This realization crystallized for me through a letter I received from a former student named Margaret. 15 years after she had taken one of my public speaking courses, she wrote, "Mr. Carnegie, I doubt you remember me, but I want you to know that you changed my life. Not because of the speaking techniques you taught, though those were valuable, but because you were the first person who made me believe I had something worthwhile to say." I did remember Margaret, though not for the reasons she might have expected. I remembered her not because she was the most talented speaker in the class, but because she had been the most terrified. She would sit in the back row, rarely volunteering, convinced that her ideas weren't worth sharing. What I had done for Margaret wasn't teach her perfect speaking techniques. It was help her discover her own voice and value. That letter made me realize that my true legacy wasn't in the thousands of people I had corrected over the years, but in the hundreds I had encouraged. It wasn't in the facts I had shared, but in the confidence I had helped others build. It wasn't improving my expertise, but in helping others discover their own. I began to understand that there are two types of people in this world: those who make others feel smaller and those who make others feel larger. The first type may win arguments, prove points, and demonstrate superior knowledge, but they leave behind them a trail of diminished spirits and damaged relationships. The second type may not always be perfectly correct, but they leave behind them a legacy of empowered individuals who go on to empower others. Throughout my career, I had the privilege of observing both types of leaders, teachers, and colleagues. The ones remembered with fondness and gratitude were rarely the ones who had been most technically correct or intellectually superior. They were the ones who had seen potential in others, who had offered encouragement when it was needed most, who had chosen connection over correction. I think of my own mentors and the people who shaped my development most profoundly. Professor Henderson, who taught me public speaking in college, never once corrected my grammar or criticized my content. Instead, he helped me find my authentic voice and encouraged me to trust my own insights. His influence on my life had nothing to do with being right and everything to do with being supportive. The teachers I remember with the deepest gratitude were those who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. They may have been wrong about some facts, imperfect in their methods, or outdated in their techniques, but they were absolutely right about what mattered most: the importance of believing in people and helping them believe in themselves. This perspective transformed how I thought about my own impact and legacy. Instead of measuring my success by how often I was right or how much knowledge I had shared, I began measuring it by how many people felt better about themselves after interacting with me. Instead of focusing on what I could teach others, I focused on what I could help them discover about their own capabilities. I realized that influence is not about getting people to think like you, it's about helping people think better for themselves. It's not about proving your superiority, it's about helping others recognize their own potential. It's not about being the smartest person in the room, It's about making everyone in the room feel smarter. The most successful leaders I studied throughout my career understood this distinction intuitively. They were remembered not for their perfect decisions or flawless strategies, but for their ability to inspire others to achieve things they never thought possible. They left behind organizations and communities that continued to thrive long after they were gone, because they had invested in people rather than just projects. In my own family, I learned to measure my success as a husband, not by how often I was right about household decisions or life choices, but by how supported and valued Lolita felt in our partnership. I measured my effectiveness as a friend, not by how much wisdom I had shared, but by how understood and appreciated my friends felt in my presence. This shift in perspective also changed how I handled my mistakes and shortcomings. Instead of being devastated when I was wrong about something, I could focus on what I had learned and how that learning might help me serve others better. Instead of defending my errors, I could acknowledge them gracefully and use them as teaching moments for both myself and others. The ultimate paradox I discovered is that when you stop trying to be right, you often end up being more right than ever before, right about what truly matters, right about how to build meaningful relationships, right about what creates lasting positive change in the world. As I consider the legacy I want to leave, it's not a legacy of perfect knowledge or flawless judgment. It's a legacy of encouragement, empowerment, and human connection. I want to be remembered as someone who helped others feel valued, capable, and inspired to reach their highest potential. The choice between being right and being influential isn't really a choice about communication, techniques, or interpersonal strategies. It's a choice about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of world you want to create through your relationships with others. When you choose influence over correctness, connection over competition, and empowerment over superiority, you create ripple effects that extend far beyond your immediate interactions. The people you encourage go on to encourage others. The confidence you help build gets invested in new relationships and opportunities. The positive impact compounds across generations. This is the true measure of a life well lived. Not how often you were right, but how much right you helped create in the world through your relationships with other human beings. As we reach the end of our journey together, I want to leave you with something more valuable than knowledge or techniques. I want to leave you with a clear path forward and the confidence that transformation is not only possible, but inevitable when you commit to choosing influence over correctness. The principles I've shared with you aren't merely concepts to understand intellectually. They are practices to implement daily, habits to develop gradually, and ways of being that will transform not only your relationships, but your entire experience of life. The question isn't whether these principles work. I've seen them change thousands of lives over my decades of teaching and observation. The question is whether you'll commit to making them part of who you are. Start where you are, with the very next interaction you have. When someone shares an idea that triggers your urge to correct or improve upon it, pause and ask yourself, what does this person need from me right now? When you find yourself preparing to prove a point or win an argument, remember that winning arguments often means losing relationships. Begin by practicing the art of genuine listening. In your next conversation, focus entirely on understanding rather than responding. Notice what happens when you give someone the gift of your complete attention without any agenda to fix, correct, or improve them. Watch how they respond when they feel truly heard. Experiment with finding common ground before exploring differences. The next time you disagree with someone, spend time discovering what you both want to achieve before debating how to achieve it. You'll be amazed at how often apparent conflicts dissolve when you focus on shared objectives rather than competing methods. Practice making others feel important and valued. Look for genuine reasons to appreciate the people around you and express that appreciation specifically and sincerely. Notice how people's energy and openness change when they feel recognized and valued. Most importantly, be patient with yourself as you develop these new patterns. You've spent years, perhaps decades, developing the habit of being right. Changing this pattern takes time, practice, and self-compassion when you slip back into old behaviors. Remember that every expert was once a beginner, every master was once a disaster, and every influential person was once someone who had to choose between being right and being effective. The choice you make in each interaction shapes not only that moment, but the entire trajectory of your relationships and your impact in the world. I've given you the tools, but the transformation is yours to create. You now have the power to turn every conversation into an opportunity for connection, every disagreement into a chance for deeper understanding, and every relationship into a source of mutual growth and empowerment. The world doesn't need more people who are right about everything. The world needs more people who care deeply about others, who listen with genuine interest, who encourage rather than criticize, and who use their knowledge and expertise in service of building others up rather than proving their own superiority. You have the opportunity to be that kind of person. You have the ability to create the kinds of relationships that make life meaningful and fulfilling. You have the power to influence others not through the force of your correctness, but through the strength of your character and the depth of your care for their success and happiness. The journey from being right to being influential is not just about changing how you communicate. It's about discovering who you can become when you choose connection over competition, service over superiority, and love over the need to be right. Your transformation begins with your very next interaction. The person you meet today, the conversation you have this afternoon, the disagreement you encounter tomorrow, each of these is an opportunity to practice these principles and experience their power. Go forward with confidence, knowing that you now possess the understanding and tools to build the kinds of relationships that will enrich your life immeasurably. Choose influence over correctness, choose connection over competition, and choose to be the kind of person who makes others feel valued, heard, and empowered. The world is waiting for your contribution, not your perfect knowledge or flawless judgment, but your care, your encouragement, and your commitment to helping others discover their own potential and value. This is how we change the world, one relationship at a time. One conversation at a time, one choice at a time, to be influential rather than merely right.